Welcome to our presentation on Chapter 35, discussing the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
I'm sure we have all studied how changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply impact the economic indicators across the economy. And now, to visualize the impact of changes in aggregate supply and demand on the inflation rate and unemployment rate, let us study the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve was first found in 1958 when wages rose and unemployment falls in the UK. So, basically, the curve shows the short-run relationship between inflation and unemployment. As you can see from the graph, the line slopes downward, which shows a negative correlation or inverse relationship between the unemployment and rate of inflation. The curve illustrates a trade-off in the economy: high unemployment and low inflation, or low unemployment and high inflation. It is important for policymakers relative to monetary and fiscal policy when they want to influence aggregate demand to control unemployment. To make you understand better, let us take a look at this example. The curve illustrates the association between inflation rate and unemployment rate. At point A, as you can see, inflation is low, which is only 2%, and unemployment is high, corresponding to 7%. And at the other hand, when inflation is high in point B, its unemployment rate is low, which is only 4% compared to the previous one. The Phillips curve shows the combinations of inflation and unemployment that arise in the short run as shifts in the aggregate demand curve move the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve. As we have learned in the previous two chapters, an increase in the aggregate demand for goods and service leads to a larger output of goods and service and a higher price level in the short run. So thus, shifts in aggregate demand push inflation and unemployment in opposite directions in the short run, a relationship illustrated by the Phillips curve. To see fully of how this works more, let's consider an example. From this figure, it assumes that a price level of 100 for year 2020 and charts possible outcomes for the year 2021. The left side shows the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. If aggregate demand is low, the economy is at point A. Output is low and the price level is also low. However, if aggregate demand is high, the economy is at point B. Output is high and the price level is also high. The right side shows the implications for the Phillips curve. In point A, which arises when aggregate demand is low, has high unemployment, which is 7%, and low inflation for only 2%. At point B, which arises when aggregate demand is high, it has low unemployment for 4% and high inflation, which is 6%. In the long run, unemployment does not depend on money growth and inflation. We always return to the natural state of unemployment, though at a higher price level. As you can see from the graph, if the Fed increases the money supply slowly, the inflation rate is low and the economy finds itself at point A. However, if the Fed increases the money supply quickly, the inflation rate is high and the economy finds itself at point B. In either case, the unemployment rate tends toward its normal level, called the natural rate of unemployment. The vertical long-run Phillips curve illustrates the conclusion that unemployment does not depend on money growth and inflation in the long run. Now let us see how the long-run Phillips curve is related to the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. As you can see from the figure, the vertical long-run Phillips curve and the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve are related to each other. In the first figure, An increase in the money supply shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, from 81 to 82. As a result of this shift, the long-run equilibrium moves from point A to point B. The price level then rises from P1 to P2, but because the aggregate supply curve is vertical, output remains the same. In the second panel, the more rapid growth in the money supply raises the inflation rate by moving the economy from point A to point B. Because the Phillips curve is vertical, the rate of unemployment is the same at these 2 points. Thus, we can conclude that the vertical long-run aggregate supply and vertical long-run Phillips curve both imply that monetary policy influences price level and inflation rate, but not output and unemployment. In the long run, regardless of the monetary policy pursued by the Fed, output is at its natural level and unemployment is at its natural rate. You might wonder, what is so natural about the natural rate of unemployment? Economists use this adjective to describe the unemployment rate toward which the economy gravitates in the long run. Yet, the natural rate of unemployment is not the socially desirable rate of unemployment, nor is the natural rate of unemployment constant over time. Although monetary policy cannot influence the natural rate of unemployment, other types of policy can. To reduce the natural rate of unemployment, policymakers should look to policies to improve the functioning of the labor market. Previously, we have discussed how various labor market policies affect the natural rate of unemployment. A policy change that reduces the natural rate of unemployment would shift the long-run Phillips curve to the left. In addition, because lower unemployment means more workers are producing goods and services, the quantity of goods and services supplied would be larger at any given price level, and the long-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. The economy could then enjoy lower unemployment and higher output for any given rate of money growth and inflation. You might ask, why should anyone believe that policymakers faced a vertical Phillips curve when the world seemed to offer a downward sloping one? Should this lead us to reject monetary neutrality? So, economists called Friedman and Phelps introduced a new variable into the analysis of the inflation-unemployment rate trade-off, which is expected inflation. Expected inflation measures and determines how much people expect the overall price level to change. It determines the position of short-run aggregate supply curve. In the short run, the Fed can take expected inflation and the short-run aggregate supply curve as already determined. When the money supply changes, aggregate demand curve shifts along a given short-run aggregate supply curve. Therefore, it leads to unexpected fluctuations in output, prices, unemployment, and inflation. On the other hand, in the long run, people expect whatever inflation rate the Fed chooses to produce nominal wages, and adjust to keep pace with inflation. Long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. Changes in money supply affect neither the economy's output of goods and services. Thus, unemployment returns to its natural state in the long run. The analysis of the short-run Phillips curve can be summarized by the following equation. Unemployment rate equals to the natural rate of unemployment minus by variable A multiplied by actual inflation minus the expected inflation. This equation is another expression of the aggregate supply equation that we have seen previously. It relates the unemployment rate to the natural rate of unemployment, actual inflation, and also expected inflation. In the short run, expected inflation is given, so higher actual inflation is associated with lower unemployment. The variable A is a parameter that measures how much unemployment responds to the unexpected inflation. In the long run, people come to expect whatever inflation is produced, so actual inflation equals expected inflation and unemployment is at its natural rate. This equation implies that there can be no stable short-run Phillips curve. Each short-run Phillips curve reflects a particular expected rate of inflation. If you graph this equation, you'll find that the downward sloping short-run Phillips curve intersects the vertical long-run Phillips curve at the expected rate of inflation. When expected inflation changes, the short-run Phillips curve shifts. To understand better, let us look to the next slide to look at the graph. In this figure, the economy is at point A. Suppose that the policymakers try to take advantage of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment using monetary or fiscal policy to expand aggregate demand. And in the short run, when expected inflation is given, the economy goes from point A to point B. Unemployment falls below its natural rate and the actual inflation rate rises above the expected inflation. As the economy moves from point A to point B, policymakers might think that they have achieved permanently lower unemployment at the cost of higher inflation. This situation, however, will not last long. Over time, people get used to this higher inflation rate and they raise their expectations of inflation. When expected inflation rises, firms and workers start taking higher inflation into account when they set the wages and prices. In the short run, the Phillips curve then shifts to the right as shown in this graph. The economy ends up at point C with higher inflation than at point A, but with the same level of unemployment. Thus, policymakers face only temporary trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, expanding aggregate demand more rapidly will have higher inflation without any reduction in the unemployment. We know that the policymakers try to take advantage of the Phillips curve by choosing higher inflation to reduce unemployment, and they will succeed at reducing unemployment only for the short run. This view that unemployment eventually returns to its natural rate regardless of the rate of inflation is called the natural rate hypothesis. A few years after this proposed hypothesis, monetary and fiscal policymakers created a natural experiment to test this. Look at this data that was made for their prediction in 1968. The figure uses annual data from 1961 to 1968 on the unemployment rate and on the inflation rate as measured by the GDP deflator, to show the negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. As inflation rose over these 8 years, unemployment fell. The economic data from this era seem to confirm that policymakers face a trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
A large increase in the world price of oil is an example of supply shock. A supply shock is an event that directly affects firms' cost of production and thus the prices they charge. It shifts the economy's aggregate supply curve and as a result the Phillips curve. For example, when an oil price increase raises the cost of purchasing gasoline, heating oil, tires, and many other products, it reduces the quantity of goods and services supplied at any given price level. This figure shows annual data from 1960 to 1973 on the unemployment rate and on the inflation rate as measured by the GDP deflator. The Phillips curve in the 1960s breaks down in the early of 1970s, just as Friedman and Phelps had predicted. In this figure, from panel A, the supply is reduced. shown by the leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve from AS1 to AS2. Output falls from Y1 to Y2, and the price level rises from P1 to P2. The economy experiences stagflation, the combination of falling output or stagnation and rising prices or inflation. In panel B, firms need fewer workers to produce smaller output. Employment falls and unemployment rises. Because the price level is higher, the inflation rate is also higher. Thus, the shift in aggregate supply leads to a higher unemployment and higher inflation. For an example, in the United States during the 1970s, unexpected inflation rose substantially. It was partly attributable to the Fed's decision to accommodate the supply shock with higher money growth. Because of this policy decision, the U.S. economy faced an unfavorable trade-off between inflation and unemployment for many years. The problem was compounded in 1979 when OPEC once again started to exert its market power, more than doubling the price of oil.
Now we will start to the fourth part of chapter 35, which is the cost of reducing inflation. To reduce the inflation, the Fed had the choice to apply the policy of disinflation. Disinflation itself is different from deflation. Disinflation means reducing the rate of inflation. Deflation itself means a reduction in the price level. Disinflation is like slowing down, whereas deflation is like going in reverse. Chairman Volcker, along with many other Americans, wanted the economy's rising level of prices to slow down. This is what disinflation is doing. However, disinflation itself increases the unemployment. Volcker had no doubt that the Fed could reduce inflation by controlling the quantity of money. But the question is, what is the cost of reducing inflation? Well, the answers to this are: first, the sacrifice ratio; second, rational expectations and the possibility of costless disinflation; third, the Volcker disinflation; fourth, the Greenspan Era; and fifth, a financial crisis that leads to the Phillips Curve. I will now explain all these 5 types of costs of reducing inflation. Now let me start with the first part of the cost of reducing inflation, which is the sacrifice ratio. Before I go deeper into the explanation, I will explain what sacrifice ratio means. The sacrifice ratio is the number of the percentage points of the annual output lost in the process of reducing inflation by 1 percentage point. From the graph on the right, the Fed applied the contractionary monetary policy. This policy means that the government is reducing the money supply. As you can see, as Fed applied the contractionary monetary policy, the economy slowly goes down to point B, where unemployment rate is increasing, but inflation rate is decreasing. But over time, point B will slowly move to point C, where unemployment rate goes back to its origin. It means by having this policy, the nation must endure a period of high employment and low output. To make you understand better, I will give you an example of the sacrifice ratio. A sacrifice ratio is 5. To reduce inflation from 10% to 4%, which means a difference of 6%, it would have required an estimated sacrifice of 6% times the sacrifice ratio of 5, which results in 30% of annual output. It means we have to sacrifice 30% of our annual output to reduce 6% of the inflation. I will now start the second part, which is rational expectations and the possibility of costless disinflation. According to this theory, people optimally use all the information they have, including information about government policies, when forecasting the future. Expected inflation also suggests that while there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the short run, but not in the long run. For the short run itself, its application to the trade-off between inflation and unemployment depends on how quickly people adjust their expectations of inflation. And last, according to Sargent, the sacrifice ratio could be much smaller than the previous estimates, that it can even reach 0. Moving on to the third part, the Volcker disinflation. The story to this is when Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Fed in 1970s, inflation was known to be the foremost problems. To overcome this problem, Paul decided to pursue the monetary policy. This monetary policy caused the greatest recession in the United States. Recession itself means the decline in aggregate output for 2 consecutive quarters, which also means that he succeeded to reduce the inflation. As you can see from figure 11, Volcker succeeded to decrease the inflation from 1979 to 1987. Although there was an increase in unemployment between this year. Moving on to the fourth part, which is the Greenspan Era. This period is called the Greenspan Era after Alan Greenspan, who in 1987 followed Paul Volcker, who created the Volcker disinflation, as chairman of the Federal Reserve. In 1986, OPEC members broke down the restrictions of supply, causing the oil prices to fall by about half. As the figure on the right shows, this favorable supply shock led to falling inflation and falling unemployment from 1984 to 1986. Throughout the Greenspan era, the Fed was very careful to avoid repeating the policy mistakes of the 1960s, which is the excessive aggregate demand pushed unemployment below the natural rate and raised inflation. So, when unemployment fell and inflation rose in 1989 and 1990, the Fed raised the interest rates and contracted the aggregate demand, leading to a small recession or a period when aggregate output declines for 2 consecutive quarters in 1991 and 1992. And so, the credit for such a great economic performance was caused by the monetary policy, fiscal policy, and the most important thing would be the depletion of the supply shocks. We have now reached the final part, which is the financial crisis takes us for a ride along the Phillips Curve. As you can see from the graph on figure 13, it shows what the crisis and the policy meant for inflation and employment. I will describe what the right side Phillips Curve explains. So as you can see, from 2007 to 2010, as the decline in aggregate demand raised the unemployment from below 5% to 10%, it is also reducing the inflation rate from about 3% to about 1%. In a sense, the economy wrote down the short-run Phillips curve. But from 2010 to 2015, as you can see, the economy slowly recovered. Unemployment rate is starting to go back to its origin. It goes back to about 5%, while the rate of inflation remained between 1 and 2%. So this is what the policy is doing to the unemployment rate and the inflation rate.
In conclusion, we have discussed the idea of the Phillips Curve, which is the negative relationship between unemployment rate and inflation rate. We also know that as we expand the aggregate demand, there will be higher inflation and lower unemployment. In contrary, as we contract the aggregate demand, there will be lower inflation and higher unemployment. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment is temporary, that it is described in the short run of the Phillips Curve. In the long run, however, the natural employment rate of the Phillips Curve will be vertical. This is all for our presentation. Thank you for watching. We hope to see each other in a much better situation. And stay safe and wash your hands, and God bless you.